if the instruments themselves are damaged, if the instruments themselves are contaminated, you can do all those other protocols and it won't mean a thing because the instruments themselves are going into the patient. And if they are contaminated, if they are damaged, if they aren't functioning properly, that will have an adverse outcome on that patient. And that's what nobody wants. Nobody woke up in the morning and said, I can't wait to hurt a patient today. That's not why we're here. Nobody does that. And taking care of those instruments is taking care of the patient.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we speak with Mike Matthews, Director of Customer Training and Education at Agiliti. And Melanie, you saw Mike speak at a Beyond Clean conference all about instrument quality and staining and rusting. Ooh, this could be a good conversation today. They're definitely taboo, and things are, I'd say, heating up a little bit out there in the industry with getting much more increased focus on the quality and maintenance of instrumentation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot more interest and awareness around instrument quality and the way that we care for them, not just in SPD, but as the OR, how we're taking care of those instruments and how we're sending them back to SPD and doing our part, because it's not one person's job. It's a collective all of our jobs in order to protect these instruments and take care of them. And it's just, when I heard him speak for the conference last year, it was just such an informative discussion that it really just felt like this was something that we should be talking about within the perioperative space and talking about it more. So, because when you understand why you're supposed to be doing something, a lot of times that really helps you actually follow through with it because it makes sense and you know what you're doing. So I thought it would be a great conversation for us to have.
Well, I think it is going to be a great one. So stay with us. After a short break, we'll be back with Mike Matthews, Director of Customer Training and Education at Agiliti.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Mike Matthews, Director of Customer Training and Education at Agiliti. We're going to be talking about instrument quality. And Mike, I've known you for a while because what kind of kicked it all off was the Beyond Clean podcast, and you joined Hank and I in the early days, I'd say probably around month 2 or 3 of that podcast. Hard to believe we're coming up on 5 years since that happened. And then you began working at Agiliti, and now, no surprise, you are overseeing all the customer training and education there because you do just such a fantastic job. And we did some internal podcasts there as well together. So I know you're a pro at this. We're happy to have you on the show. And I've seen you do a lot of education around instrument quality. So this is your sweet spot. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's been a while since I've done one of these. And I got to tell you, it feels good to be back in the saddle, as we would say in the South. And I'm particularly excited about being able to share some of that, just the passion for seeing quality instrumentation put in the hands of our perioperative partners.
So I gave everybody a little flavor of your background, but there's a lot more to be said. Why don't you tell everybody more about yourself?
Sure. So I come from the world of sterile processing. I started doing sterile processing when I was a seminary student in Louisville, Kentucky. I knew absolutely nothing about sterile processing when I got hired there. In fact, I tell people all the time that when I went in for my initial interview, the manager asked me, hey, do you want to have a tour of the department? And I said, sure, because I have no idea what's going on. And in my mind, it was like two dudes and a dishwasher is what I told him. Like that's what I'm picturing in my head. And I go in there and it turns out, this is like a 45 plus employee, 24 hours a day, 5 autoclaves, 5 washers, full on operation. And my mind is just absolutely blown. So I go in, I start learning as much as I possibly can to get certified. But the reality is I still knew so little. And I tell people all the time, I've studied multiple languages, including Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew, and still could not pronounce the word carotid when I started. It's so funny, like how foreign the world of healthcare and surgery is, but I can promise you that if you really dig in and learn as much as you possibly can, you can grow. What I used to do after I did all my certifications was one particular hospital I worked at had a librarian, and this librarian would just give you research studies as long as you asked. And what I told her to do was do a search, find me anything that has the word sterilization in it, and send it to me 10 studies at a time. And she did. And I would just get 10 studies at once, read them all, do the next 10 studies, and plow through every single thing I could find my hands on. And here we are.
Well, sometimes that's just the best way to learn. Jump in with both feet and just figure it out and go for it. My husband actually also is very well versed in ancient Greek and Hebrew, and some of those words are hard to pronounce, but so are the OR. And the operating room is just a whole different world. Sterile processing, OR, all of it. And when you were giving your presentation back in November for one of Beyond Clean's conferences, I was hosting that. And as I listened to you teach, I was just thinking, wow, this is such good information for the all of perioperative space. And the OR could really benefit from learning about instrument care and point of use cleaning and what are we looking for when we check our instruments. So I really just thought it'd be great to talk more about that. But when I open my tray and I'm setting up my back table and I look at it and I'm like your title of your previous webinar had said, dude, what happened to my instruments? I mean, but what happened? What causes them sometimes to look dingy or rusted or stained? I mean, that's big, different topics, but what causes that sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a multitude of possible options. And of course, in that particular presentation, we're talking about water quality and the effects that water quality have. And point of use cleaning can have a massive impact on those things as well. I really enjoy sharing this information with the perioperative team because I like to describe the relationship between peri-op, or particularly surgery, and the sterile processing department. It's kind of like a marriage. You're stuck with each other, and how well you get along is going to be affected by how well you understand each other. When you don't understand each other, it tends to lead to a whole lot of conflict. That's how we tend to see the relationship between the OR and the SPD is there's not a lot of understanding. There's not a lot of cross communication. And the result of that is that things that are happening in one department can have a detrimental effect on the other department. But it doesn't stop there. It comes back around. And so we find a lot of times the OR is really kind of making their own lives more difficult by making SPD's life more difficult.
Can you go into that just a little bit further? Give
Sure.
me an example. How does that
Sure.
work?
Well, so we could talk about point of use cleaning, for example. The OR, sometimes, they have competing priorities. And one of their priorities, one of the things that they are measured most, stringently against is room turnaround time. And because of that, sometimes the attitude is I got to get my stuff on the table or into the cart or wherever and get it out of the room as quickly as I possibly can so that I can start wiping things down and cleaning the floors and doing all that sort of stuff. Then go to check the other cases and get set up, all those things that have to be done. And the thinking process is, well, if I can just get this out of my room, it's not my problem anymore, right? And what is missed in that is if we forget to spray enzymatic on our instruments as they go out, and there's, dry bioburden being left behind on there. If there is saline that is being left behind on the instrumentation, those things make the instruments harder to clean. They can degrade the quality of the instruments. And then sure enough, when you get that set back, that's the set that all of a sudden has pitting all over the instruments. And you say, oh my goodness, these instruments look terrible. How did this happen? Well, part of it probably is sterile processing's fault, but then a pretty big chunk of it too is that they were set up for failure when the instruments weren't taken care of properly in the first place.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about the saline part of it, because in point of use cleaning and the understanding that saline versus sterile water in instruments and the huge difference or the detrimental nature of saline on our instruments. Can you go into some of that for our audience?
Sure. So what makes stainless steel stainless is it has a component in it called chromium. And chromium, when it makes contact with the oxygen in the air, forms a compound called chromium oxide. And that is actually what protects the iron part of the instrument from the damaging effects of the oxygen in the air on iron and keeps it from forming rust, right? And so we call that layer of chromium oxide the passive layer. And it's a amazingly strong material. It's water resistant. It's really what gives stainless steel its strength. But the downside is it's like Superman. It has one weakness, and the kryptonite of stainless steel is salt, more specifically chloride ions. And, salt is NaCl. That Cl part, that's those chloride ions, right? And so anything that has those chloride ions in them will bind with that chromium oxide and then cause it to break down. And as those holes begin to form in the chromium oxide, it opens the channel to the iron part of the instrument. And then when iron starts mixing with oxygen, it becomes what we call rust. So again, saline is used in 99.9% of surgeries, you probably have to really struggle to find a surgery that doesn't use saline, right? And so it's used in all of these procedures, and it is the one thing that damages these surgical instruments more than anything. And so we really have to be mindful about getting that salt off of the instruments. Another compounding factor in there too is that most ORs, the temperature is kept low because everybody's wearing their PPE, right? And so they want to keep it cold. And because of that, the air tends to be very low humidity. And that low humidity, cool air causes the water part of the saline to evaporate very quickly. And as it evaporates, it's leaving the salt behind. So the saline is actually becoming more and more concentrated as it's evaporating very quickly. And again, that's just causing that increase in stress on that chromium oxide, and it just does not take long for it to break down.
So, Mike, I understand the process of doing the point of use cleaning, but the next step of that, when it goes down to sterile processing, is there an impact when those instruments are being delayed in terms of going through decontamination? Even if you spray enzyme on them, is there changes that can occur over time?
Oh, sure. I mean, as soon as that saline is left behind on those instruments, you're on the clock, right? And so if you've got your decontamination that is backed up, you've got one person working back there because you're short staffed, and, those instruments are going to wait for 5 hours before they actually get all of that stuff washed off of them. Yes, all that time is compounding, and that saline is going to work on those instruments that entire time. And then one thing to remember about that enzymatic spray is that enzymatic is tailored to break down certain materials. And of course, in enzymatic's case, it's tailored to break down proteins, lipids, and starches, the things that you find in blood, right? One thing that it is not very good at breaking down is salt. And so it does a great job of breaking down and keeping bioburden from drying. But the salt on the instruments, it's not going to do much for that. But I do want to point out, though, that let's say hypothetically you skip the enzymatic portion of it, like we've seen many facilities get in trouble for. Don't forget that those same compounds, like chlorides, are found in blood, too. Right? Your blood has all sorts of minerals that are great for your body, but terrible for your instruments. And if they are allowed to dry onto the instruments, not only does it become more difficult to clean, but again, you will see the same type of pitting begin to happen from bioburden that you would see also from the use of saline.
I didn't realize that. I wasn't thinking about blood having chloride. It's just something you don't think about, but I could put the sodium chloride together for saline, but not thinking about the fact that if I don't use my enzymatic, then I'm causing the same problem with blood. That's a very good point. I had not thought about that before.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Mike, the biggest issue is soaking too, right? Like, yes, wiping with normal saline instead of sterile water is definitely a concern, but I've seen people put the instruments in a saline bath because they don't make sterile water available, for the instruments. And instead of just wiping, they kind of drop them into that bucket. And that's a whole different issue. The wiping is still not good, but soaking is a huge no-no, correct?
I mean, it's just the volume of salt, right? It's the volume of chloride ions. And if you wipe it, you're going to get some salt. If you soak it, it's literally immersed in salt. And again, if you've got a bucket of saline there, the top part is evaporating, and very slowly that salt concentration is becoming more and more concentrated. And the more concentrated it is, the more damage it's doing to that chromium oxide layer.
So you talked about pitting, and one of the issues with pitting is it's kind of like a cavity in your teeth, right? So once those caves are in there, it doesn't matter what sterile processing does to brush the instrument or clean it. It just can't reach those nooks and crannies, just like you can't brush a cavity out of your teeth once you have one. So when these instruments get back to the OR, and hopefully they don't, but sometimes they do with either staining or rusting, it's very difficult to diagnose, hey, is this a stain or is this rust? And if it is rust, how do they know if it's pitting? Because sometimes the pitting can be very microscopic as well. How do they know what's safe for use if there's any discoloration when it gets to surgery?
That's a great question. And actually, that's one of the things we discussed at the conference that Melanie's referring to earlier. I don't feel like that's really something that the perioperative staff, the OR staff, should be trying to do in the middle of the procedure or even before the procedure, right? Because kind of the mantra of the OR is rightfully going to be, when in doubt, throw it out, right? Like, you're always going to err on the side of safety. And you're right. Those pits, they can be microscopic or they can be hidden inside of a box lock. And the OR simply is not going to be able to examine the instruments in a way that it assures that what they're seeing is a stain, which does not have risk for the patient, and a pit, which absolutely does have risk for the patient, right? So you're asking the OR to make that determination without the proper tools and absolutely at the wrong time. And so the idea is that really, by the time it makes it to the OR, it's too late, right? Like, that should be done in sterile processing, and it shouldn't ever make it to the OR staff in the first place.
And I've even seen a lot of people start to mention to me, they talk about it on message boards. I know they're reaching out to you, some of your customers, and saying the Joint Commission came in and did a survey and they found staining on the instruments and they cited us for that. And I feel like that's a whole nother level now where, yeah, maybe pitting and things like that, but to actually, have that show up in the survey related to staining, even though, like you said, staining may not represent an issue to patient safety. At the same time, I think it relates to how you just described that scenario. And I don't want to speak for the Joint Commission. I obviously don't have any insight on that, but I think that closer look at staining has a lot to do with the fact that how do you know? And are you, and I think staining can often be a symptom of a lack of preventive maintenance or a water quality issue. And all those issues need to be addressed. And so that could be the underlying cause for any kind of results like that showing up in a survey. But I think people really need to be aware of that staining is gaining a lot of attention in the industry in the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, and I think the reason is exactly what you just said, is because it's symptomatic of another type of process failure, right? So if a Joint Commission inspector sees that an instrument is stained, it's going to cause them to begin asking questions. And if you've ever been through a Joint Commission inspection, that's kind of the way they work, right? Like they'll go into an area and they'll find something that just doesn't look right? It just piques their interest. And that's when they start asking questions about that one thing. And they'll just pick on that one thing until they really get down to the root of it. And when they get to the root of it, like it's usually something that could have been prevented or was done wrong. And staining is an example, like you hit the nail right on the head. If you've got a lot of staining issues, it's very likely that you have problems with your water quality. And it's very likely that you aren't doing good preventive maintenance on those instruments. And so they're going to start asking questions like, what's your water quality like? Do you have RO water feeding into your washers? What's your steam quality like? Can you tell me the last time that pair of scissors went out for maintenance? And usually that's where we see it on the repair side, right? Is customers saying, hey, we just got in trouble from the Joint Commission for, stains on our instruments. But they were in a break fix situation, right? So they only send the instruments out when the OR complains about them. And sure enough, the OR never complains about the stains, right? They only care about the scissors not being sharp. And so when you're in that situation where the instruments aren't being seen proactively, that's when you start to see issues with staining start to peak up. And it just starts that conversation that you don't really want to have with the Joint Commission.
Mike, I do consulting work, and a while ago we had a hospital that was getting staining after sterilization, and the doctors started complaining about it. It wasn't even Joint Commission. They ended up shutting down the OR for several days trying to figure out what was happening with those instruments. I mean, can you give us some ideas about what can create staining problems from sterilization?
Yeah. Buddy, staining, I tell you, sometimes I like trying to find the root cause of pitting a lot more than staining. In the presentation that I gave that Melanie was referring to, I kind of lay things out to where if it's pitting, it's higher risk. But the good news is there's really only a handful of causes. When it's staining, it's lower risk. But my goodness, the number of potential causes that could lead to staining, it is nuts. Poor water quality being fed into your washers, poor water quality coming from the boiler if you're using house steam, which most facilities are. It can be an additive that the facilities team has added to the boiler water to help it maintain what they think ought to be the proper ranges of, content and foaming of the water and all that sort of stuff. Like they have their own parameters, but the parameters that they're creating in the boiler, they're generally not aware of what the parameters are supposed to be for reprocessing surgical instrumentation. And so they may be adding chemicals or something to that boiler water with zero understanding of what effect that's going to have on the steam that's coming out of your autoclaves. The cleanliness of your autoclaves can have an effect on this, right? So we go into facilities sometimes. Our company does sterilizer cleanings. And we'll look at an autoclave and, it'll just be caked with hard water stains that have been left behind. When those get built up to a certain degree, that steam as it's coming out of the steam lines and into the autoclave can actually pick up mineralization off the sides of the autoclave and redeposit it onto the instruments as it's sterilizing them. I've actually had a couple of instances, and Justin may remember this because we were working together on this one, where a particular facility had just an out of nowhere staining problem occur. Just out of nowhere. It was totally fine. And then all of a sudden it started one day. And the more we dug into it, the more we really kind of had to broaden our parameters. And I think I figured it out by looking on that city's municipal water supply page and realized that they were doing construction on a water main 1 block north of the hospital. And that was the feed water that was coming into the facility. So just the simple fact that the municipal water supply company was changing out a pipe, it changed the feed water that was going into the facility. And just that change in feed water changed the mineral composition of the water. And that mineral composition was making it onto the instruments in the form of what we call stains. So I'm always hesitant to try and diagnose a stain because there's just so many possibilities for where that stain could be coming from.
All right, that's great, Mike. And I do remember that story. And I also, just for the listeners, want to make sure everybody knows what RO stands for. If you could talk about that. And then as we also talk about RO and its sister term, DI, maybe you can define that too and relate it all to Amy ST108 that's going to be coming out soon.
Yeah, I should have defined my terms better. RO stands for reverse osmosis, and then its close cousin DI, which stands for deionization. Now, those are two different ways of achieving water purification. And that's what ST108 is really all about. And so for those of you who don't know, the standards for device reprocessing come from the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, or AAMI. And usually the big daddy standard that everybody kind of looks to for instrument reprocessing is ST79. But Amy has a number of other documents, including some documents that are just there for your information. Those are called TIR reports. And one that is all about water quality is called TIR 34. But Amy actually announced 2 years ago now that they were getting ready to elevate TIR 34 from being a, just there for your information, good suggestions, good stuff to know, to a standard. And so it is going to be released, I believe, sometime this year. That's kind of was the anticipated time, but we all know how COVID seems to have shifted dates on a lot of this stuff. But we do know that it is going to be released at some point. It's going to be called ST108. So it is much more serious in terms of the expectations that it's going to put on facilities, and it's going to be all about water quality. There's going to be expectations of managing that water, of measuring that water. Again, the exact parameters haven't been announced yet. I can tell you what's in TIR 34, and I can tell you that no municipal water supply has ever qualified under what they're saying. So, this is going to be really important, not just for that final rinse, but also for the quality of the water that's being fed into those steam lines. And I think that's going to be where a lot of places get stuck.
I think that's really interesting to make the connection all the way down to just the water, something that we don't think about as being a potential for the staining or for the problems we have with our instruments. But when you think about instruments, yes, in the OR, we might think of instruments as being SPD's problem, but they're not, because we need our sterile instruments in order to do our surgeries. But instruments are a huge investment of the department. And the better we care for those instruments ultimately leads to a better investment. And I was wondering if you would kind of make that connection maybe a little better than I can, but about how our investment is protected when we as the OR do our part with our instrument care.
Yeah, one thing I never have to convince an OR staff about is, the horror of an instrument breaking or not performing during a procedure. When I go to talk to sterile processing teams, sometimes I have to kind of inform them about what that's like for the OR. But OR professionals usually get this. They understand what it's like when an instrument breaks right in the middle of the procedure, or the scissor gets stuck right in the middle of the procedure and the surgeon is getting frustrated.
Or the lap grasper.
Grasper. Yeah. Woo! I mean, you understand this, right? It has a dramatic effect on that case. And it can potentially have a dramatic impact on that patient too. I mean, so, your OR staff, what is their number one priority is protect that patient, right? Number one above all other things. And so you have a number of protocols to protect that. And so we have all these things we do when we're in the OR. We have to keep our hands above our waist when we're around the sterile field, and we have to always be facing the sterile field, no turning your back to the sterile field. We have all these things in place to try and protect that field. field because that's how you protect the patient. But what I want OR staff to know, and what I really have to tell SPD staffs a lot of time is, if the instruments themselves are damaged, if the instruments themselves are contaminated, you can do all those other protocols and it won't mean a thing because the instruments themselves are going into the patient. And if they are contaminated, if they are damaged, if they aren't functioning properly, that will have an adverse outcome on that patient. And that's what nobody wants. Nobody woke up in the morning and said, I can't wait to hurt a patient today. That's not why we're here. Nobody does that. And taking care of those instruments is taking care of the patient.
All right, Mike, I think you wrapped that one up nicely. But before we do kind of send you on your way, is there anything you want to add to this conversation that you think we might have missed that is really key for folks working in peri-op to understand?
I would say, understand that what goes around comes around. So therefore, the quality of the instruments you push out of the room, that may not affect you today. That may not affect you tomorrow, but at some point you're going to get that cruddy set back and you're going to be mad about it. Don't be afraid to go down to sterile processing and just learn, just ask them, talk to them, give them some love, show them some appreciation. It's rough down there in sterile processing in terms of getting positive feedback about things that have gone well. Their expectation is that everything is done 100% right, 100% of the time. And when you're in that situation, that means you will never hear anything except when something goes wrong. And so when somebody comes down there and just says, hey, thank you, that case went really well. My sets looked amazing. The scissors functioned great. That's such a huge encouragement. And what you'll really find is that if you start talking to them about how the instruments are used in the case, and the impact that it has for good or for bad, they'll actually just eat that up because they don't get to see the patient. They don't get to see the outcomes. You do. And so you can provide that information to them and they can provide information back to you. And I promise you that marriage of SPD and OR is going to get a lot better.
All right, Mike, fantastic job in this interview, although no surprise to me. I've known you for quite some time, but Melanie actually recruited you, not even me, to the interview. So I've got to give her some credit for spotting your talent at the conference as well. Appreciate you coming on today.
No, my pleasure. It feels good.
That was Mike Matthews, Director of Customer Training and Education at Agiliti, and you've seen him around the conference speaking circuit, that's for sure. Does a great job of explaining things, good analogies, and Paul, I think this is an area where there's just been heightened awareness and heightened focus, and I think it's about creating a culture of care for the instruments, and ultimately that results in better patient care.
Absolutely. It's such an important topic, and I think that it's great that the regulatory agencies have really kind of focused on instrumentation and the point of use cleaning because it has such an impact on patient care and on the life of the instruments. So, and the patient. It's really an important issue, and I was really good to hear what Mike had to say. He really does know stuff.
Yeah, he's absolutely an expert in the industry. I've known him for a while, and he has a unique blend of that ability to bring a lot of detail and at the same time make it really digestible and understandable if you don't have like an in-depth understanding of some of the concepts. I mean, just the way he explained sodium chloride and how that relates to the chloride ions in blood. It's just such a really important point to make. So that's going to do it for this week's show. But as a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. Also available on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or you can simply search for First Case on your favorite podcast application. We've also got bonus content for certain episodes, but you have to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android and click on that gift box. And we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. On behalf of Paul, Melanie, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case.